Huge country in Southwest Africa, and it's one of the most interesting places in the world. It's larger than Texas, and if you placed it off the coast of the eastern United States, it would roughly stretch from Boston down to Charleston, South Carolina. And yet, it's almost completely uninhabited by people and totally empty. Just take a look at this global map of human population density and pay close attention to Africa, where there's a big, empty void of people across the entire southwest corner of the continent. Namibia makes up most of that void, and there's only around 2.5 million people who live in this entire country that's about the same size as Western Europe. For context, that's even less people than live in just the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area in the US state of Minnesota. This makes Namibia, on average, the second least densely populated country in the entire world, with only about 3 people per square kilometer of land on average. That's a lower population density than either Australia or Canada, and it's only just barely a higher density of people than Mongolia, the most sparsely populated country in the world. But the Namibian population pattern just gets weirder and weirder the more you look at it and think about it. Mongolia is sparsely populated because it's completely landlocked in the center of Asia between the inhospitable tundra of Siberia and the inhospitable sands of the Gobi Desert. And so it kind of makes sense that there aren't really a lot of people there. But Namibia isn't landlocked and in fact has the 10th longest coastline on the entire African continent. In nearly every country that has a coastline, most of their populations live near to the coasts, for generally obvious reasons. There's just substantial economic benefits to be had by being located near to the ocean, which enables people to conduct maritime trade with the rest of the world, grants easy access to fishing and other valuable maritime resources, and grants better opportunities for tourism and recreation. This is why in the 21st century today, more than 40% of the worldwide human population lives within just 100 kilometers of a coastline. And the United States is the perfect example of this geographic norm. As much as 60% of the American population lives within one of the 772 counties that are directly adjacent to a coast in the Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, Pacific, or the Great Lakes, which have access to the world's oceans through the St. Lawrence River. China is very similar, where about 60% of China's enormous population lives within just these areas nearby to the Pacific coast. Nearly everywhere you look on this map of where people actually live, you see the same pattern of people living nearby to a coastline, from South America to Europe, across Asia, and in Australia. There are very few exceptions, and perhaps the biggest anomaly of them all is the coast of Namibia, which is almost completely abandoned in stark contrast to most of the rest of Africa. Strangely, the coastline of Namibia is actually the most empty part of the country, and the vast majority of the few Namibians who even exist live hundreds of kilometers away from it, deep within the interior. Around half of Namibia's small population just lives in this landlocked area up here in the north, immediately across the border from Angola. This is the population core of Namibia, but despite that, the capital and the largest city, Windhoek, is this tiny dot of high density way down here, hundreds of kilometers away, in the dead center of the country, surrounded by basically nothing and nobody in every direction. Windhoek is a big, modern city home to nearly 500,000 people, or about 1 in 5 Namibians. But it's also the only actual city in the country. Everywhere else are just scattered and remote towns, rural communities, or literally nothingness for hundreds of kilometers. Especially along the coastline, which is the most remote part of Namibia and one of the most remote places in the entire world. And the many reasons why this is the case are fascinating. The first thing to understand about the Namibian coastline is that it is completely dominated by the narrow Namib Desert, from which the Namibian country takes its name. It stretches for more than 2,000 kilometers from southern Angola to northwestern South Africa, and across the entire Namibian coastline. Nobody knows exactly how long this desert has existed here for, but there are some estimations that it's been around since at least the dinosaurs roamed the planet, making the Namib the most ancient desert in the world. It is also one of the driest and most susceptible to wild temperature variations. Certain areas of the desert only manage to receive around 2 millimeters of precipitation throughout the entire year, and temperatures can range anywhere from a stable 48 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit on the coast to 113 Fahrenheit to below freezing just a little ways inland. This makes the Namib the only true desert to exist in southern Africa, and also makes it one of the least hospitable locations on the planet. And it exists here in this narrow strip along the Namibian coastline for a variety of factors. The southeasterly trade winds generally blow across the region from the Indian Ocean, but they have to first pass over the high slopes of the Drakensberg Mountains here, and in doing so, the winds lose a lot of their moisture to the mountain's eastern slope. The winds will then blow across Africa's Great Escarpment, and by the time they reach the Namib, the winds are largely hot and dry. These hot and dry winds then clash with the cold ocean current in the area known as the Benguela Current. This current forces frigid water from the dark and cold depths of the southern Atlantic to move up and then flow directly along the coastline of southern Africa, which makes the waters just off the coast here significantly colder than they are over in eastern Africa. Winds blowing into Namibia from the Atlantic side are therefore generally humid and cold, but when they encounter the opposing dry and hot air blowing in from the Indian Ocean, the colder and more humid Atlantic winds are forced down beneath them. This means that rather than generating rainfall, the humid and cold Atlantic winds more often just become dense clouds and fog. The Namib Desert, and therefore the Namibian coastline as well, is thus one of the foggiest locations on the planet. The coast here usually experiences more than 180 days a year of dense fog conditions. And that has made the Namib coastline one of the most dangerous locations in the world for sailors to travel along for centuries. Ships that get lost or confused in the fog have been crashing and wrecking themselves here almost since time immemorial, and it's estimated that today there's more than 1,000 different shipwrecks from all kinds of different historical eras that litter the foggy Namibian coastline. These hundreds of rusting and rotting holes dotted across the coast are why the Namibian coastline is often referred to by its other well-known name, the Skeleton Coast. But it's not just the fog that makes the Skeleton Coast such a dangerous hazard to sail across. It's also that huge country in Southwest Africa, and it's one of the most interesting places in the world. It's larger than Texas, and if you placed it off the coast of the eastern United States, it would roughly stretch from Boston down to Charleston, South Carolina. And yet, it's almost completely uninhabited by people and totally empty. Just take a look at this global map of human population density and pay close attention to Africa, where there's a big, empty void of people across the entire southwest corner of the continent. Namibia makes up most of that void, and there's only around 2.5 million people who live in this entire country that's about the same size as Western Europe. For context, that's even less people than live in just the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area in the US state of Minnesota. This makes Namibia, on average,